much, and it's been a pleasure. Are you okay? It's been a pleasure working with the township on this project. Really started in September of 2017, and now we're at the stage where we're able to give the final report. And I'm here, like the president would say, that the state of our feasibility study is sound. And that's very important. You like that? But seriously, no, it shows that this is feasible. You're going to hear how everything has come together, you know, thus far. And as Kevin said, that you'll be hearing from Lexden, which is a company that can fund this project. So some of the key players here that we have are Paul Heitman, who my colleague there. Paul has a technical background and works on standards for IEEE. I do government and community relations. Joe Blackwell is the lead horse on this, and he's an expert on microgrids and Stromboli. That's a little inside joke. And then we have Sridhar, who works with Joe at Leidos for the design part, and they're really the go-to people for all the information that we put together, as is Corey. And lastly, we will, but not leastly, we will be introducing you to David from Lexden Capital that can talk about the P3 model and how we can really get this project underway.
Just to kind of orient everybody, community microgrid is really designed to provide broad-based resiliency for critical facilities in the community, hopefully coordinated, but certainly to ensure that they're able to function in the face of a major interruption, whether it's a matter of hours or a matter of days, and we'll talk about that in some more detail, but that's sort of a general view of what a community microgrid might look like, with distributed generation, various types, and coordinated across a variety of facilities. Those are the requirements of the report, the study that we had to conduct, and we received word that the BPU has deemed the study as complete and conforming, which is great news. That means that the grant will be funded. So we met the first milestone with hitting these requirements, and now we're kind of on to figuring out how we can get this done. That's the list of, at least the high-level list of facilities that we considered as part of the study, and you'll recognize all of those, I'm sure, most of them anyway. These are all selected based on some level of FEMA designation in terms of their criticality. That was a key part of why this study was selected for grant funding. So they're all deemed in one form or fashion or another as, I guess you call it, critical infrastructure in the case of some kind of an emergency situation like a storm. Some shelters, obviously, sewage authority and the naval weapons station, fire stations and the like, and all designed to keep things operating when there's an emergency. This was our project timeline. The report was delivered as promised, and it's nice to put a schedule up that actually happened the way we said it would. This hasn't changed since we put it up the first time, so at least we kind of stuck to that. That's always a good thing on any project, right? We used some special tools to create inferences out of the data that we did have, and arrive at the conclusions that we did. Reliable, but just kind of pointing out that the opportunity for using more granular data is certainly an important one overall to explore. We made that recommendation in the report as well. This slide is really designed to show the high variability and reliability across the different circuits that we were considering. System average interruption duration is a standard utility measurement for the reliability of an electrical circuit. It basically relates to minutes of downtime. And you can see year over year, these five circuits, even though they're anonymous from a confidentiality perspective, highly variable in terms of their reliability. Sometimes a lot of interruptions, sometimes not much, but clearly
not a really good high quality story in terms of the evenness or the stability of the environment. So this sort of further highlights the opportunity to implement resiliency through a microgrid. Okay, I'm going to let Paul come up. What we're going to talk about now is sort of some of the research that we were asked to do as a part of the study. Some of you have seen this before, so we won't dwell on it too much, but these are some of the various categories of information that we were asked to research and provide as a foundation for it.
All right, thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone, again. I think I've seen a lot of you, but there's a few new faces. So, as Joe said, this is kind of a recast. I'll go quickly through it. In the report, there's a lot more detail behind here, but I just really wanted to start with, as I showed before, some of you may remember this chart, that this represents the time intervals that the grid operates at. This is microseconds, milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours, days, decades. All the stuff on this side is long-range investments, days, months, years, that's effective at balancing the grid and providing reliable energy. And all of the, down at this end, are the balancing needs immediately that the grid has to provide. So our central tenet is that an islanded microgrid has to be able to operate itself down in this area, to be stable by itself. When it's connected to the grid, as Kevin said, parallel, now you've got what's called inertia. So you get the entire grid that helps you stay up, and it doesn't have to be so immediately balanced. But it definitely has to integrate and coordinate with the grid. So essentially, this is just a time frame to keep in mind. When building a microgrid, it has to be able to island and self-balance and connect in parallel and provide services to the grid. And one of our central premises is investing in these assets should have a return. For providing grid services, we should be paid for providing those grid services, as well as delivering energy within the microgrid, which is its primary goal. So there's a lot of discussion now with PJM, Penn, Jersey, Maryland. This is the Interconnect Authority. In the region of the country we're in, it's a deregulated market where wholesale power is produced by generators that compete. And right now, the big competitor is natural gas generation because the cost of gas is so low. But the emerging renewables, not so much wind, but solar, not offshore wind anyway, it is driving the price down. So it's coming to parity. It's already below the cost of nuclear, and it's coming to parity with natural gas, but without any of the potential volatility to exposure to prices. So putting renewable energy in locally, coupling it in with balancing for a community, a microgrid, is just a long-term, sensible investment. And you get the benefits of resilience and lower cost power over time. So PJM right now, in the wholesale market, is a meshed network. There's all kinds of redundant paths that can be called on for these generators to deliver their energy to. But when you come out to the edge of the grid, it's all radial, except for some, unique spots. So radial means that the medium voltage and low voltage distribution company, in this case JCP&L, buys power from this big pool of power and then pushes it through their circuits to your load at the end. And that's traditionally how the grid has been built. But the conflict that comes out of this is, do we invest in the reliability feeder to reinforce those lines, or do we take more of a virtualized approach at the edge of the grid and really harness the flexibility and capability of that? So I think you know what our conclusion is. We should really take a look at what these DER storage types are. This was some of the research that was done here. There's a lot of them, and they're growing, and they're coming down in price, and they are being adopted whether the utility likes it or not. So let's look at kind of technologies. First of all, energy storage is a big push in New Jersey right now. There's a requirement, soft requirement, but recommendation of 600 megawatts of energy storage to be implemented by 2021 on a goal to 2 gigawatts to 1,000 megawatts by 2030, I think. So we're the leading state in the nation to set an energy storage target and to push that out. And by far, we are the biggest one in the near-term goal. This is basically tomorrow. So we need fast-acting, building this, standing it up, getting it running, and hosting some of this energy storage. And that's one of the reasons that a public-private partnership can wade through a lot of the bureaucracy to put something up, stand it up, and get it running. And if we can help contribute to that goal. The idea right now is that grid storage has applications both for managing JCP&L's wires, if we can get appropriate compensation, valuation and compensation, that will help offset the cost. And then, of course, it helps integrate solar and wind. And even there's a great role for fast EV charging, as a buffer to the grid. So putting fixed energy storage in to buffer the grid is good. And you can see the cost curve on energy storage. It's 80% drop, and some are even saying that this is still too high. That there are breakthrough technologies right around this time frame, and I'm actually working with a few of them, I think, will punch down through. So the cost of energy storage won't be a barrier, and the utility of it is huge. Solar PV, as you know, is being deployed privately, and utility scale solar isn't allowed to be owned by the utilities because, again, in New Jersey, PJM provides all the wholesale power with competitive generation, and the distribution company just pushes the wires, maintains the wires. So building solar at utility scale is a good option, but also the price of this is coming down so highly distributed. Rooftop, putting it on a school building, residential, is economically viable. And Joe, when we cover on the model results, will show you that that's the case. So this was just a reminder that solar is here, it's not going anywhere. Even with the SRECs changing, there are still investments being pushed forward in New Jersey for solar and around the country. And then the last is, even though I sort of poo-pooed natural gas, it is cheap and it is abundant, and it's probably going to be here for quite a while until we fully transition to non-carbon-based fuels, if ever. So in the model that we ran, we sized some of these smaller, these are very small, but really important natural gas generation. Natural gas serves all of the sites, I think all of the sites we looked at. So there's an option to have a mix of natural gas, solar, and energy storage in the right mix and combination. And it makes economic sense, and those were the three. Fuel cells, not so much, they're still expensive. Some of the other more exotic technologies we didn't include here. These were the recommended technologies that came out. One last thing that we didn't really fully explore, but that is a technology, is demand response. So an opportunity to have actually sophisticated Internet of Things kind of sensors and signals that can tell load when to drop is every bit as important as being able to put more generation in. So probably when we go into the design phase, we will include looking at demand response as one of the technologies. And ultimately what this leads to is what I call transactive energy, I and many others. It's kind of a buzzword, but it is more than just a soundbite, because a truly transactive grid has all that power and capability of those generation types, the balancing, the services, and the mechanism to pay for those services is what's missing. How do you send a signal that represents how constrained the grid is, what the real price of energy is, and then let people act on it? Whether it's all the way out on the days, months, years, and the action there is invest in new equipment, and own and operate that, or whether it's down at the seconds of reaction and say, I need help balancing my voltage, and I will pay you X. The idea of transactive energy is you're putting a signal out that can then be captured, utilized, and integrated with very strong algorithms to optimize the efficiency of this. So the end result is highly distributed energy that's coordinated with tight, fast communication is environmentally, economically superior right now. And the matter of just opening up those value streams is where we're trying to build this. So we ran into many challenges. These are the summary of the key ones. Obviously, existing regulations don't want this to happen and kind of make it difficult. And we recognize that some of those barriers are very legitimate, others a little bit more disingenuous, but they're barriers nonetheless. And this is a barrier on the utility side. Again, we're in a deregulated state. They have to buy their power from the competitive market, generation. They can't own generation in New Jersey. And that includes energy storage, because that's kind of a form of generation. So maybe we want to think about ways that makes more sense for the utility to truly invest in assets that are big and have multiple value streams, whereas the smaller ones or the more immediately beneficial are privately. So kind of a hybrid. David will talk more about the hybrid approach at owning assets. This was a big barrier that, right-of-way restriction, you cannot cross this, you cannot export power, so don't even think about oversizing your generation, at least right now, and pushing out, energy to other people, because then you're a utility. And basically, we talked about some of the findings. Not only could we not get data, but what we finally did get is, we sort of surveyed what investments were made along each circuit over the past 7 years on the distribution system. It was basically zero. That's what we were told. There's been no investment, which I think everybody realizes. That's why the SAIDI curves kind of go all over the place. And then lastly, there's no AMI here for even measuring interval consumption of energy. So one of the barriers we found was the data, limitation of access to valuable data that could help optimize solutions. So bottom line is, just kind of calling it what it is. Franchise protection is threatened by this, and I just collectively call this preemptive friction. I think it's an appropriate term. Let's stop this before it gains too much traction. But it's not. It's unstoppable because of the economics and environmental attributes. And then a variety of other ones that highly dependent on volumetric sales. So one of the things you may notice, and you may have seen already, that there's a big push on utilities to move to a decoupling from volumetric sales. Think cable bill, $50 a month, independent of what energy you use. That's an evolution around the country. A lot of utilities are moving towards. So don't be surprised if you see that. PSEG has already, their chairman's been out saying we should decouple from volumetric sales. There's some good and there's some bad about that. So that is a trend right now. And really, you've got to have the kind of methodologies that can value externalities like carbon offset, local power production, reliability, community involvement and enhancement, all those kind of things. The good news is some of this modeling is starting to be done. I think it was mentioned in Rutgers. They have a tool called RULESS. I don't know what it stands for, but it's kind of a way to quantify some of the net benefits. And in fact, this Friday, they are evolving that tool to energy storage specifically. I'm going to be attending that in Piscataway. And that's actually evolving the tool to give a quantified way for the commission to look at energy storage in terms of net benefits. So I'll be arguing that let's fully value the benefits that a battery provides and quantify that. And then, of course, we know that adoption of new business models and technologies are not moving forward. So we have limited transparency in rate case process. One of the positives of the rate case process is everybody gets to go to Trenton and weigh in, but you could still argue that the actual transparency, even though there's a stakeholder process, is questionable. One of the things David's going to talk about is the process of capital allocation and expenses is a highly transparent process, the way they implement capital investment. So I think that's a theme of our whole project. transparency, everything in, no hidden agendas, this is what we want to do. Let's have good arguments about the pros and cons. I won't go into detail on this, but suffice it to say that a primary current prohibition on reselling energy limits the amount of generation that we can put at any given site and forces us to stay behind each meter with that generation. So it's suboptimal. It's still economically viable, but it's suboptimal as opposed to looking at more 1 or 2 or 4 centralized that are allowed to export energy to different locations. That's a different model for the utilities. So I won't read all this, but this is kind of a compilation of what we've seen, what we saw as barriers, a little bit of a categorization. So with that, let me introduce David to come up here and tell us a lot about approaches to getting capital and funding flowing to build this out, independent of whether this is approved as a next phase of BPU, but certainly cognizant of the fact that it has to be transparent, and we want to put the money to the right assets and achieve some of the goals of Microgrid.
Which way is this?
That's for
Good evening, David Suarez. I'm President and CEO of Lexington Capital. We're a mid-size real estate and infrastructure investment firm. We like to work mostly in the P3 or public-private partnership arena. I'm also chair of the Finance Committee for Smart Cities Council, so I get a lot of education on technology and quite often, like the rest of us, we find it somewhat confusing, but we rely on people that are very smart, such as my associate there, to tell us, point us in the right directions. My job is primarily, I get brought in to mostly troubleshoot, but in this case it's a nice positive early stage input on my part, and try and figure out what are the best ways to structure transactions so they can be financed optimally for the consumer, the ultimate user. If I can work this technology, we'll see. So what I try to do sort of here is give an outline. Here is really give you an idea of what are your options in financing anything. Doesn't really matter whether we're financing widgets or whatever services that are needed to you. In this case, it's a resiliency power generation system, and there's an awful lot about the technology that needs to be reviewed and so forth over the next year, but that's not my area, thank goodness. My area is to say to you, okay, how do we work with you over the course of the next, hopefully 2 years to get this thing built versus a traditional financing method. So if you look at number 1, I don't know if you can read all that from that far back, but basically what it does, I try to give you the pros and cons. And by the way, this is all going to be available online for you. You can email questions. Happy to answer questions directly as well. But the idea is, option number 1 is a traditional federal, state, or public utility financing. Pros and cons are, it's a fairly simple execution in theory, because that's the way we've been doing things for so many years, and that's so I think politically, socially is sort of acceptable, and that's how we do things. But one of the things that we're starting to realize in that area is that it isn't that simple. Underlying all of this, you'll hear me say this time, this meeting and any other meetings, that technology is changing rapidly. This is nothing new to anyone in this room. It is extremely disruptive. So you have to be very careful with how you structure and finance long-term capital expenditure, because you do not want to be restricted by that commitment today when things change in 5 years. Then what have you got? You've got a grid that's obsolete. So I don't want to scare anyone. What I'm trying to say is what we need to do is we need to be adaptive. And with a public-private partnership, we'll get to, that helps you actually have a partnership with the private sector on an ongoing basis. It's not about having a partnership now to build something. It's about having a partner that can help you through change over the 20 years or 25 years and to be adaptive. Because I can guarantee you that things will change, and the need for this microgrid or any other asset that the city develops is going to change. So whatever contract you enter into, whether it's a contract with a bondholder to raise money to do a project, or otherwise, you need to make sure you have that adaptability for that, to cope with that disruptive nature of technology. So the number one is very straightforward. I'm not sure how much you want me to go into the traditional method of financing. It's a common statement I often get when introduced to city controllers is that such and such said I should speak to you. I understand it's going to cost me more money, but I should speak to you. So why do you think it's going to cost you more money with the private sector? Well, we can borrow cheaper. We can borrow much cheaper. It makes sense. Maths makes sense. Municipal borrowing is much cheaper than private sector borrowing. I said, look, if you go back to your last 3 and 5 projects that you did on the traditional finance method, how often with the bid price that was approved, what did it really cost you when you finished the project? And if you look at the math, I'm sure you'll find that in the best of cases, the price with work change orders, which is what happens quite often, which is allowed within the system, within the traditional system, and is common practice, you'll end up with a 20 to 50% more higher price, plus your service will be delivered to you maybe, well, usually much, much later. Because the incentive for the contractor in those situations is to delay, because he gets paid more. So the incentives aren't aligned with your interests in the traditional method. That's one of the points I wanted to make. I don't know if you can feel free to stop me and ask questions if you have any questions on that. So the solution, I thought, is simple. These are very simple, and there's a lot more detail to be worked out. But the solution number 2 is quite straightforward. It's basically behind the meter. And I'm going to blend between the option 2 and 3 right now, and we can certainly answer questions as we go along. What I would suggest is that you structure a P3 project where you commit to the long term to the project. You have to decide if you want it first. If you want it, then you're going to commit to it. And even if you do this under option 1, you're still going to commit to it either way, and you're still going to have to do all the design and engineering work anyway. Then you're going to pay for that. Under public-private partnership, I'll pay for that. What I need is your guarantee that you're going to do the project, because I don't want to pay for it and then you decide that you don't want to do the project. That's not really doesn't work very well for me. But and I'm sure it's the same for you. If you're committed to the project, you're committed to the project. So I don't think there's any conflict between option 1 and 2. In that case, it just saves you coming up with the procurement of the capital, which generally speaking in most municipalities that I speak to, generally procurement of capital projects is somewhat of an issue. It's a lot more difficult than an operating budget rate. So once you commit to that, then we go forward, spend that year in, and we were talking about earlier, it could be as much as $2 million to fully design the network that you want, working with you as a city, and how Lexington would partner with you, not only during that initial phase, but also development phase, but also in the construction phase, and also on the management phase. Don't underestimate the management phase. It's so important that the interaction between us as partners stay there for the long term. That's what keeps this as a service. The service doesn't disappear as soon as you build it, does it? You think that we go through all these machinations of building something, design, construction, who do we do this, how do we do that? And we get there, very few people, a lot of people forget what needs to the input and the ongoing service that's needed. So that's what the community wants, a service. So I think that's primarily what we're talking about, how we offer, I think, supplementing your, it's not so much about money, to be quite frank, and I can get into that further. It's about supplementing your man hours and with expertise and man hours on the private sector that are used to doing this, delivering a service quicker and easier. The ultimate, what that does ultimately is what it does. It guarantee through us, we can guarantee a price and a completion date. I think that's the that's really the big thing. The ongoing service and ongoing partnership is a matter of us working that out together, how we want to work that service together. But really, the delivery is on price and on time. And with a resiliency power grid, you really there's no time is the issue, isn't it? It's been what, 6.5 years since Sandy? What's been done? Well, all along the East Coast, what's been done? Hardly anything. We take a system with option number 2. We're going to merge, and I'll get into that in a second. We're probably going to merge option 2 into option 3. But by doing option 2 first, what we're going to do is we'll have the contract, we'll start. We'll get the engineering done, the design and the construction budget and so forth done, working with you. Then what we're going to propose to do is go back to the state as a team and see if we can't get the governor to put pressure on the PUC to backstop this whole thing in front of the meter, rather than just work behind the meter. By the way, if we can do that, which I think we should do that, and I'd like to spearhead that, and we'll fund that ourselves, not only will you be a case study just in New Jersey, but you'll be a case study nationwide. No one has a P3 project finance as a state program for energy, for resiliency microgrid. We have it for solar. Every state in the union has a subsidy program. The governors have insisted that the public utility companies have a subsidy program for solar. Now, I submit to you that a resiliency program is much more important than solar. Solar is wonderful, and it's green, and everything's great with that. But that's a wonderful thing to go toward. But resiliency is a necessity. To me, it's a different category. I hope I'm not ruffling any feathers with that one. But this is a necessity. So the timing of this is important. If you go through traditional methods, I suspect you could be talking about this still in another 2 years in terms of what's going to finish on design, and probably by the time you go through procurement, it could be 4 years to 5 years before you have a product. If we have our way and we work together, as I suspect we might, we could have an operating system delivering power in 30 months, under 30 months. It's a huge difference, specifically for resiliency. The key here, though, is if we go in if we do that with your help as a partnership on option 2, option 3 becomes available. But you don't. You can go in with option 3 to start with if you want. Go to the state to try and get in front of the meter. I suspect that could add another year to 2 years to the process. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. Seema, did I miss anything? Next slide, okay. So this is sort of how we work. So there's a little bit of a shapes, a little bit like I've been bit around. But so the Exeter Capital pretty much acts as developer with the right expertise. Depending on how the city, how the township wants to work, we could even work as a co-developer. I've done that with other municipalities too. So I certainly would suggest we are co-owners of the system. Unlike most private partnerships, we would like to be co-owners with the municipality, not just or a quasi-government entity that you create to be co-owners with us. So we get your continuous input. Again, going back to service and ongoing service and development. We would bring in, obviously we don't need to bring in Leidos because Leidos is here on the design engineering side. I don't need to get into Leidos and their qualifications. I'm sure you know that already. Nationally, internationally recognized for design engineering for microgrid. we would we can work with you depending on how you want to do the bidding system, RFP system. We can either run that with you or run it ourselves depending on what authority we're able to have. I can show you other structures that we've used with other cities in the US and how we've created entities to take care of all that rather than going through the typical long drawn out process which can delay service. We bring in, but we would highly recommend for this type of service a best-in-class construction company. The key here again is the construction company with a balance sheet guarantees completion on budget and on time. You keep hearing me saying that all the time. That's one of my favorite things. On budget and on time. My interests are aligned with you. I want this service to get online efficiently and on time because I don't make any money otherwise. You don't get the service, I don't make any money. So I'm completely aligned with you in terms of getting quality. Now, I want to just forewarn you of a point I made earlier. Very often in a traditional system, as I said, of finance, you will get I think pretty much by regulation, they have to go with the lowest bidder. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what the price that you're going to end up with on the product, as we've discussed earlier, because typically the lowest bidder has the most work change orders because he's the lowest bidder, so you end up paying a lot more. So, but going in on the guaranteed price, you're probably going to be, I would say on average on a product like this, maybe about 20% higher than a lowest bidder would be, but it's guaranteed. And it's guaranteed to be completed on time or they pay. So there's serious penalties if they go above beyond the timelines in the contract. So I always tend to think that from a public perspective, even from a government perspective, they're managing other people's money. Well, I am too. But you're managing other people's money, and I'm managing other people's money too. I'd like to say to them, okay, I'd rather be conservative and say this is what I can deliver, and this is what I can deliver. Because then my investors come back to me again. Government, I think, should be doing the same thing. This is what we borrowed the money for. This is what we borrowed, or we committed cash flow for a service. This is when it's going to be delivered, and here it is. And by the way, this guy with a triple-rated balance sheet, investment grade balance sheet, is guaranteeing it. So now, it's I know maybe passing the buck a little bit, but I'd rather pass the buck to somebody with a very strong balance sheet that's going to guarantee the completion on time. So that's sort of how this sort of works. And again, I think I emphasise and try to overemphasise the management and the operating company. I think and this can change quite a bit in terms of depends on how your office wants to work it. But I would highly recommend a co-ownership on the management side, or at least a partnership on the management side, so we can get that input. That's it on my side. I mean, I can tell you later how many problems there's been with projects that weren't done, that should have been done with the P3 that weren't done, and how much they went over budget. But it sounds like a lot of you know that problem.
So what I'm going to try to do is walk without taking too much time through the approach we took to complete the study. And Paul and I are kind of trade off on some of these points here to kind of cover all bases. The goal of the study was to identify technically and financially feasible alternatives for microgrids. Obviously, central generation, meaning you house all the generation required to serve these various sites in a central location and provide the copper required to serve those. We kind of like that's option one. The regulatory barriers preventing that right now, as well as significant additional cost from the standpoint of bolstering the distribution system as it currently exists today. Multiple independent microgrids. Whether they're substation centric or actually site by site, is a way of, working around the regulatory barriers and putting the right amount of generation and storage at each location, either from a substation perspective, trying to serve specific feeders, or at all the sites, and ultimately, at the end of the day, finding a way to manage those in a coordinated fashion for the resiliency goals that were the objective of the study. And in essence, kind of setting number one aside because it's really precluded, we focused on the bottom two, numbers 2 and 3. Just to sort of restate basically the goals of microgrid as we kind of were in that diagram earlier on. Connecting these various locations in an appropriate architecture to serve the resiliency requirements so that their various missions are achievable in the event of an interruption or an emergency. Really, the starting point for that analysis was looking at what were the local requirements to serve the load in a number of different interruption-based scenarios. So we looked at different types of grouping and control and coordination opportunities. And as you'll see, we're going to talk about in a minute here, we tried to use industry standard methodologies to evaluate the optimal generation and storage mix and understand the cost-benefit balance in those cases to determine the economic feasibility. Oh, by the way, the DIRCAM, which I'll talk about shortly here, Distributed Energy Resource Customer Adoption Model, is a DOE-produced tool out of Berkeley Labs, I believe, and was one of the requirements that the BPU placed on us to conduct this evaluation. So it was at their request. I give them a chance to compare these studies on an even footing, basically. So just as for the sake of illustration, an example might be a microgrid conducted on the grounds of substation affinity. So you're basically grouping sites based on the substations to which they're aligned into the distribution system. This illustrates in a connected mode. You can see the green circles and the green squares. In what we call a blue sky condition, everything's operating. You're drawing your power from the utility. It's normal operating conditions similar to what you would have today. Under a microgrid scenario, when there's an interruption to that to the house power, if you will, the incoming utilities power provision, each of those sites, in this case, the illustration we used a fire station and Earl and one of the elementary schools, they're basically running on their they're running on their own generation and storage for the duration of the interruption and continuing operation as normal. I'm going to let Paul talk to this. This is a discussion that kind of gets to the economic model that we were just talking around with David around asset ownership and decentralization, and then the next diagram that really explains the kind of the economic structure in a real simple way.
Right. So, we decided there's many ways you can kind of break it down and section this, but really the key things is who owns the asset, and this is minimal utility ownership and maximum. And then this is how decentralized are the assets. So you can still have sort of a local concentration of assets, but so along those dimensions, this is what many people know, at least that have been around long enough like me, used to be the utility in New Jersey and still are in the southern part of the United States. They're called vertically integrated utilities. They own the generation, they own all the big long transmission wires, they own the distribution, right to your meter, and they sell it. When they want to implement a microgrid, like Duke Energy and places down south, if it makes economic sense, they do it. And Duke Energy is implementing microgrids. So there's a data point. Right? They're in full control and they're implementing this. Here, it's broken up, as I said before. So the wholesale market provides the power and the distribution utility is not vertically integrated. They just do the distribution. So a utility ownership of that obviously is maximum here, and it's also very minimally decentralized. decentralized. They own all the big assets, they push it through wires. When you dial back on utility asset ownership, but still have centralized assets, you're looking at like a commercial industrial facility. Like if a big warehouse or a steel factory or something like that wants to put a coal plant or a gas plant or even a big battery, they'll do that, and it'll just be for their own operation, commercial and industrial. And so that's this model where utilities don't own the assets, but they're very centralized. So when you move up to, I'll do this one next, the fourth one, that's going to be something, take note of that term, DERMS, because utilities around the country right now are seeking rate recovery on investments, and if they're not doing interval metering programs, $1 billion a shot, they're going to be coming and saying, everybody's putting solar out there, I need a tool to manage this, I need to, get recovery on a DERMS, DER management system. And a lot of vendors are more than happy to comply and build that. And that's part of a model that has maximum investment and ownership of that by the utility, but it's designed for maximum decentralized assets controlled by the utility. We're advocating this quadrant, number 3, which is minimal utility asset ownership, not zero. Maybe there's a scenario where they could own the batteries, because they can put that capital to work, as an example. And in combination, the rest of it could be owned, privately. And maximum decentralized and then virtual aggregation. So community aggregation is sort of the model we jumped into. So without further ado, and this is where we'll come back and talk about the cost, here's the concept of the model where JCP&L, because of the barriers I talked about before, still provide the bulk of the energy delivery, just like they always do on their wires, right? This is blue sky, and these facilities use the non-critical energy at their facility. But we're coming in and putting in local generation and the mix, Joe will talk about in a little bit. And, it could be, doesn't have to be, but a utility authority is formed by Middletown as an agent that will interface through an energy service, it could be a DERMS connection from the utility, to get signals and provide this critical energy service. So installing these assets for the facilities, running and operating this, and delivering that piece of the energy need such that if this line breaks in the next superstorm, this piece of the critical load is always served with high reliability, performance guarantees. That's the concept. So recovering the cost for that piece is what would flow here, and it would be financed in 25 years, 30 years, whatever the term is. My point, so does that answer? I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, it gets to that answer. And then you can imagine if this energy service is set up and the board authorizes or mandates JCP&L to pay for voltage support services at the edge of their grid, this revenue stream flows into this in addition to what's flowing out of this. That's the idea.
The value streams.
That's the value stream we want to put in place.
What you see on the screen here is sort of basically a diagram from the folks who produced their can, which, as I said, was the Berkeley lab. It's really a way of taking data around the resources and the requirements for a particular site and exploring, different types of distributed energy resources and developing sort of an optimally balanced scenario from a load serving perspective and from a economic perspective. And there's plenty of detail in there describing this, and also available online. It's very easy to find.
So I talked briefly about earlier, and Paul mentioned it also, that our data was not rich. We had monthly consumption data for all the sites, and that's basically what we got. So the good news is that DERCAM provides load profile generation tools based on the type of facility that it is, or at least an ability to approximate what a load profile would look like, aligned to the cost paid for each of the sites. So for example, they have basically representative load profiles or demand curves for schools, office buildings, and different types of facilities based on the region of the United States in which they're located. So, and as it turns out, we spent some time validating that these were accurate and that they were able to properly reflect the actual energy costs that were being paid by each of the sites because we had that data. And it turns out that they're pretty accurate. So what we were able to do was, for example, in the case of school, is generate load curves based on the data specific for that site using the DuraCam tool. So we're able to do that and say, on a representative day over these hours, here's the type of load you're going to see on a weekday, on the weekend. This is all detailed in the report. Municipal complex or an office building type environment, you can see the difference in these loads and when you expect high levels of demand, low levels of demand. This is important from the standpoint of trying to optimize the generation mix. So we were able to overcome the paucity of data with tools in a defensible approach, from some industry standard mechanisms, which was very helpful. Feeding the tool in order to generate valuation, and in particular around the cost of interruption. There are some industry standard tools. You can actually research this if you'd like, but we talk about it in the report. Called the ICE tool, the interruption cost estimation tool, that says for a particular site or a particular function, you can develop a cost of outage for a particular duration. Cost per unserved kilowatts per hour is basically what we focused on for different types of facilities. This is just one representative picture to help kind of illustrate that. We also developed defensible estimates based on cost for different types of generation, whether it was natural gas, photovoltaic, storage, and we used real tariff information from the utility as an input to the tool as well for actual cost of the energy as on the balancing side. I'm not going to go through all these in detail in the interest of time, but we went through 9 scenario analysis for each of the sites, or class of sites, if you will. Sort of our reference case on top with basically no outage, and where we looked at does a reference case tie in with their current energy usage cost and consumption data. So it was kind of our way to validate that the tool was behaving as we needed it to behave. Then we allow the tool to, without constraints, recommend a certain set of generation mix for a particular site, and then by applying some constraints to force it to include storage, force it to include PD and other generation sources in case those weren't included in the original optimization. We ran that same set of 3 scenarios for a 12-hour outage and a 7-day outage. And we found that the 7-day outage, kind of conservative, I guess, but given Sandy, not totally unrealistic, right? We want to be able to provide an estimate that gives ride through for an event like that so that facility can be assured of continued operation. And in reality, if it's going to ride through for 7 days, it's likely going to be able to ride through for longer than that. So that was kind of our assumption there. So we ran 9 scenarios for each of the sites to understand the generation mix and the economical value of that. Every one of the sites has a representation like this. This is output from the tool. Once again, we use this because it provides an apples-to-apples comparison at the request of the board, the BPU. They wanted every study agent to use the same methodology, so they had some way of comparing them. In this case, I don't remember which site this is. I believe this is one of the high schools. This is a view of a 7-day outage and what the basically the optimal generation requirement would be in terms of new generation technologies, new storage technologies, and what those investments represent. And the tool's very effective in terms of presenting savings from a capital perspective, savings from an OpEx perspective, and also CO2 emissions and efficiency around that, and then projecting that over a 20-year lifespan, which in virtually every case, proved to be a positive outcome in terms of the economic viability. For those of you who want to take a look at it, each of the sites is also profiled in terms of when each of the DER resources is dispatched during the course of a 24-hour period under an outage scenario. So you can see in this case we've got natural gas, we've got solar, and we've got storage. And when each of those is employed to serve a portion of the load as the day progresses. And there's actually even a representation in here of the battery charge state and how that recovers over the course of the same 24-hour period. So you can see here the not only the usage of the generation, but the sustainability of that usage model over that period of time. Well, lots of numbers on here, but each of the scenarios is detailed. Each of the scenarios is detailed. The base case, the low resiliency 12-hour outage case, and the high resiliency case, and information about the new distributed energy capacity, the details of what that mix looks like in each of those scenarios, balanced against the utility purchase and presenting an annualized cost savings in terms of dollars and percentage, and also the CO2 emissions, whether there's a positive or negative effect in that regard based on that particular mix of resources. This is available for each of the site classes in the study. So you can see not only the economic benefit, but also the environmental benefits and the energy benefits from each of the scenarios. To kind of summarize it all, another eye chart. All the sites are detailed here in terms of new DER capacity required, what that capacity consists of. In the case of these sites, photovoltaic, natural gas, or storage. What the capital costs are required to accomplish that, O&M costs on an annualized basis, total, and then balanced against cost savings. And then over the 20-year project life cycle, and then a benefit to cost ratio, which you expect to be positive in a beneficial economic scenario. And in the case of this study, every one of the sites has a benefit cost ratio significantly better than 1, which is really the baseline expectation. This is not sorted, so it's not like the balance of the sites, and this is not all of them here, but the balance of the sites were at or above basically that 1.97 that you see right there. So all the sites really do have a positive economic outcome in terms of the investment required to install this generation and operate it over a 20-year lifespan, which is why David and his team are interested in working with us on this project. Paul, I'm going to let you
Yeah,
talk about the
I
last
can
one.
just speak to this quickly. So this is really setting up the last couple slides for Joe, and it's an abstraction of the report where it was in the regulatory discussion and the barriers, and went into some more detail about what's stopping us from doing this from the regulatory standpoint. But then we proposed a 4-step process to actually overcome some of the barriers. Step 1 is what we're talking about right now, which is, we called it, copper bound and data bound. Those are 2 sets of constraints right now that prevent this from happening. Copper bound is somebody else owns the wires and they have franchise rights and you can't cross them. that's the one we've been talking about, and you can't export. Data bound is, by the way, even though you're producing all the energy data, we, the utility, own it, and it's proprietary, essentially. Or, you need to serve us an Oprah, whatever they call it, open public record, Oprah, to get it, which is the process we went through. So, with that, within those constraints, it's still economically feasible to build out partly against that. That's why we're recommending step one, let's get some private capital, if that's the, most effective, least, resistant barrier, and let's build some of these out. Second, and these are recommendations we're feeding into the policy reform process, unlock the data vault. So pass legislation, put policy in place, other states are doing this, to securely give access to this important energy data. Not even privately identified information, because the utilities claim, these are our customer records and nobody can have access to it. But at least enough aggregate view to say, here's where an innovative solution could really yield big results. So right now, that data is just blocked, does not come. So we're recommending to the BPU that in their energy master plan and in their policy that this is step two. Open up methods to getting some of the energy use data for people so good innovative private solutions can come to bear and it's not locked out. Third one, this is kind of borrowing from a concept of what our neighbors to the north are doing in New York and other states. They are recognizing that this distributed energy resource has value streams. Energy storage has a lot of value streams. Solar, even distributed demand response, ability to dial back load on a signal from a utility when it's a valuable service. But there's no method of valuing. There's no market mechanism to deliver and offer the value and have somebody go, I got something that'll take care of that. Here you go. Pay me. This is an important part of opening up the path to transactive energy. So that's what we're hoping when we build this microgrid platform. You can almost think of it as we're putting the construct in place that this microgrid's up and running at partial capacity, just recognizing the current constraints. But now we have a platform to incrementally add, and then as regulatory barriers fall, turn this into a monetary benefit which only reinforces the value proposition. That's the goal. But this is in conjunction with stating how those are valued. And you can refer to New York's, they have a proceeding called Value of DER that their Public Service Commission authorized. Doesn't necessarily mean it goes smoothly and utilities are loving it, but at least it's recognized that you have to do this. And then the fourth one is probably the most radical, but it makes a lot of sense. Again, there's other states that are doing this. Canada, Ontario province is doing this. They're defining and encouraging a regulatory sandbox where you can say, well, you know what? All these great new technologies could be put to use. Maybe there's valid data, maybe it's not as good as you say. Let's suspend the regulatory restrictions for this very limited scope. Could be Middletown, could be a part of Middletown, could be, as the first one to do this. And set up that sandbox to test these assumptions and test this technology and see for a certain finite period. So our recommendation is that in their deliberations and policy that they allow regulatory sandboxes and put some parameters of how those would be set up. And that's a pretty strong recommendation, and a lot of people probably are afraid of that because they don't want it to be seen how effective it is. But that's the only fair way to do it, and that's a transparent way of doing it. So we're going to be pushing pretty hard for regulatory sandbox construct to be put in place in New Jersey. So with that, Joe can take our final recommendations.
So we kind of broke our recommendations into two pieces, and the first was to basically engage a public-private partnership, as David was describing, and really seek to deliver the resiliency benefits that the municipality requires, and value that based on the cost of interruption and some of these other factors to identify the right value streams to recapture that investment. but basically ultimately install a subset, a selected subset of these sites, or a large subset of these sites, yet to be determined, to actually install the generation and develop those sites, and at least explore an overlay control system to coordinate load serving and grid support services under the various, the dark sky, blue sky conditions that the report describes. And basically pay for that, in sort of the economical construct that we described earlier, under the power purchase agreement structure. And address the data bound concerns by getting approval to get advanced metering installed, which benefits the utility, benefits everybody here. And then from a secondary recommendation standpoint, build out the second set of sites in the microgrid, the set of community sites, and with the regulatory sandbox that Paul was just describing, really explore in detail the level 3 coordination that I think the BPU sought, which we found to be not quite achievable, the original kind of thinking that they had, but certainly economics being there, removing the regulatory barriers to implement that. And this is described in detail in the report as well. Okay, you're still on time here. So key takeaways. Technically and financially, this is achievable, especially with the support of a partner that can deliver private sector efficiencies in terms of delivering the project, managing the costs, and capitalizing on the value streams. The benefits are there for Middletown citizens in terms of the emergency services provided by these facilities. As these generation costs fall, it becomes even more economically feasible. And these estimates were based on real numbers as of basically November last year. And we are seeking, in this case, to hopefully prompt some action on the part of the state to remove some of the legislative and regulatory barriers that Paul's describing, that I think really allow the next order of functionality and value out of a system like this. And there you go. So the study discusses all of this in a fair amount of detail. You're welcome to read it. And there we go.